Hello. On today's program, we're joined by Cameron Leckie, retired Army Major and strategic commentator, to analyse Australia's future, critique the AUKUS agreement, assess our Indo-Pacific role, and propose alternative pathways. Prepare for a thought-provoking discussion on Australia's global stance and some good ideas for something different. Thanks for joining us today, Cameron. And just to get things started, just sort of wanted to get a bit of a background on what you do and what you see these days.
No worries. Well, thanks for the chat, Joel. I spent 24 years in the Australian Army, straight out of high school, so joined at 17. And for the first half of that, my father was conscripted during the Vietnam era. All I ever wanted to be is in the Army. I was all in when I joined. As a 17-year-old, 18-year-old young adult, like all I wanted to do was go to war, which as a almost 50-year-old, turn 48 in a couple of weeks. I couldn't think of anything worse now, and I certainly wouldn't want my kids to get involved in that. It took me, I don't know, it was a fairly long process, maybe, I don't know, 6-7 years, and probably started sometime after the Iraq War, particularly once we realised that there's no weapons of mass destruction, and pretty much it was all a lie. What led us to that conflict? We started to question things. And then once I started questioning things, which, it was from a mental sort of, created a bit of cognitive dissonance in that, we talk about what we're on the side of democracy and freedom and all those good things. But, things weren't aligning with what we're doing and what we were saying we were doing. And the more I sort of started thinking about this, started reading about it, the more concerned I became that we were actually heading down the wrong direction, or a direction I didn't agree with. And by the time I finished my Army career, so I think the last year of work was 2018, I discharged in 2019, I'd sort of come to the conclusion that, the Australian Defence Force, its primary objective wasn't the defence of Australia, which I have no problems with, but rather supporting the United States' imperialism. And I thought that was not in our best interest, either Australia as a country or the world. Once I got out of the Army, and I guess once you have a bit of clear air from in an organisation where that sort of view's not really discussed or thought about too much, I became a bit more forthright and started writing and been speaking and, getting involved in trying to hopefully change the direction of our sort of national security direction for our future, basically.
And you've been doing some work in and around the Australian parliamentary war reform, and you also yourself ran in the election previously as a candidate, right?
Yeah, so I'm a member of two groups, so the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, which the hints in the name, we're Independent Australia, and one that's peaceful, and also a member of Australians for War Powers Reform, which is sort of born out of the Iraq War, but its core idea is that the Parliament should make the decision on who goes to the Parliament makes a decision on when we go to war, particularly not talking about defending ourselves, like that's a no-brainer. If someone attacks us, we should defend ourselves. But if we're to send troops overseas into harm's way, then it's the Parliament that should make that decision, because we are, after all, a democracy. And once we head down that direction, our whole trajectory of the country can change. So they're two sort of fairly important groups that I'm part of, or I believe are important groups. And I did have a run in the Senate for Australia's Voice, which is a new political party, which Senator Payman over in WA, a previous Labor senator, that basically the Labor Party left her after they're sort of not following through with their party platform on what's happening in Palestine. And I guess brand recognition is the first step. So we got a bit under 1% of the vote, I think, across most of the states, which not huge, but given the party's only been around for a couple of months, I guess nothing to be disappointed about either.
Totally, Cameron. And incredible that the Australia's Voice sort of popped up in the way that it did, and the intent of your presence was felt, I think. I wanted to sort of speak to you before we move on. You joined in the first term of the Howard era, the military, right? You were involved in Interfet, or around Interfet in East Timor and the Solomon Islands?
Correct. Yeah. So I did 3 deployments. So I I just literally got to my unit, my first unit after doing all your training. I was an officer, so you do 4.5 years of training before you actually hit a unit, and all pretty keen to go overseas. And within a couple of months, we were in East Timor, so September 1999, which was pretty exciting as a young soldier, young officer. My mum wasn't so excited when I told her I was going. There's a deathly quiet at the other end of the phone, but I mean, it wasn't a war per se. Like it was certainly a conflict, and there was tension there. And prior to our arrival, there'd been a lot of death and killings and murder and stuff like that. And I worked I worked quite closely with a number of locals during my time there. And you'd drive around with them, they'd point out and say, "Oh, someone was killed there, or they burnt someone there." So it was pretty real. So that was an interesting experience. And I went to the Solomons, a bit of a short stint, but doing some communications work there, and also went to Banda Aceh I went to Sumatra, including a few trips up to Banda Aceh after the tsunami in Boxing Day 2004. So see a few different parts of the world, and I guess it gives you a bit of an appreciation of our life here in Australia and how well off we are. And like to think that through a sane foreign policy and our relations with other countries, we could keep it that way.
Yeah, you'd want to hope. You were in there though. So what I question your the way that you sort of embraced your service, because you said you sort of went in there gung ho, wanting to go to war, yet you were involved in these kind of they were probably more conventional Australian operations at the time, which were peacekeeping assistance after natural disasters, without knowing all the geopolitics that might have influenced things behind East Timor and things like that in the aftermath. It felt like the remit of the Australian Defence Force was much different to what you experienced after 2001, I suppose. Do you feel that you sort of modified your gung-ho-ness as far as wanting to go out and engage in conflict in this period? Did you feel like maybe you synced up with the Australian remit at the time? Or, did you consider that part of, going out and serving your country?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, when you're in the Defence Force, you go where the government tells you to go, and we need it to be that way, because otherwise the Defence Force would fall apart if it was I'm not interested in that trip, but I'll go over there, or I'll fight that battle, I won't fight that. And I would have, circumstance had been different. I would have been in Iraq in early 2004, but I had a posting for some personal reasons. So my replacement went, and I didn't go, and I wouldn't have thought twice about going. It was. I mean, we've had all the September 11 attack on the US, and obviously the US had a fair bit of sympathy in the world after that. And I mean, little did we know that particularly the Iraq campaign was, all based on a load of bollocks, to be frank. I get Saddam, not a nice person, but bad's not. You can get worse than bad. So he kept the country under control, and what we've seen since, obviously, is that country in much of the Middle East has gone from much worse than what it was prior to our intervention. So I guess there's a reason why young people join the army. It's because that's when you're most that's when you're most willing to do crazy things. But as you mature and grow up, and you get a sort of broader perspective and that sort of bulletproof view of the world, which I think most young adult males in particular have, wears off after a few years, and you start growing up. I guess all those factors, as well as just observing what's happening in these never-ending wars, which when we see what's happening in Afghanistan or Pakistan or that, where they're firing Reaper missiles and killing wedding parties with 30 or 40 people at a time, stating that they're attacking insurgents, which they may or may not be, but you start saying, well, hang on, is the cost worth it? Is this really what we're about? Especially, you get taught all about the wars of armed conflict as an army officer, and that gets reinforced as that's what we stand for. Like warfare is the controlled application of violence, but when we start just unleashing violence without that control and for reasons which you couldn't put your hand on your heart and stand up and say, yeah, this is the right thing to do, that's when you start to question, what you're doing and why you're doing it.
So this was a quite a unique thing that was happening after the global war on terror began. The whole perception of serving within the armed forces changed. The operations changed. We were no longer looking at these regional situations that you were involved in. You were looking at being in another hemisphere, fighting in a foreign country, engaging with insurgents that belong to that topography, to that landscape, and have a unique link to the conflict. Is this a common experience felt by modern ADF as they grow wiser and grow out of their bullet fantasies in their early days? Is this a common sort of transition now in the modern ADF where these wars, they weigh upon a soldier more than potentially serving in East Timor did back in the late 90s?
Yeah, I think it's unique for everyone, and we all have, our own experiences, what we see, what we do, I guess our own sort of character coming into our conflict and, our biases. So it's unique. I'd say I'm probably a bit of an outlier, but I'm not on my own. So I don't know a lot of people who think similarly to me, but it is amazing how when you put yourself out there, not a lot, but reasonably regularly get contacted by someone who's been in the military and sort of said, oh, at last someone who sort of thinks similar to me. So, I mean, it's funny when we'll talk about the US as we get on, I think, but you talk about people to people one-on-one, and there are quite a few people who'd sort of, take the mickey out of the US or wouldn't be all gung-ho with the US and would see through like a lot of the things the United States was doing. But I guess as a group and as a culture, as an organisation, it's sort of that so it goes against the grain. But yeah, you'd speak to not all individuals, but yeah, quite a few, and you can have a decent conversation, and people question what why we're doing things, and being so closely tied to the US. But yeah, sort of as an institution, we're very much encultured to sort of be thinking that way, sort of very supportive of the alliance with the United States.
So getting onto the United States, long being a dominant force in the world, and under our, we've been under their security umbrella for quite a while. There have been some drastic changes, under the last administration, but particularly under the first 6 months of the Trump administration, that has kind of thrown things like AUKUS on its head and changed the whole way that American diplomacy and influence and reach is perceived. Do you feel that there is a bit of a change happening right now?
Looking at the big picture, like you can just see, like I first wrote about the potential for the United States to head towards, decline. I had published an article in the Australian Defence Force Journal, I think in 2012 was the first time I started, and that was after a couple of years of sort of thinking, well, that's probably where the United States is heading. And, it got published and I didn't really receive too much feedback or anything like that. But then I wrote similar articles in, a more direct article towards the end of my military career, and it didn't get published. I think it was called Polemic by one of the reviewers. And I guess that was interesting. It's like when I first wrote about it in 2012, published in 2012, it was like I looked far enough in the future that, we could let this slide because it's something to think about, but it's not really confronting or it's not too close to the bone. But once by the time I got to 2018, 19, and already the US was looking a bit ragged around the edges, I think that was, people are starting to get a bit prickly about asking hard questions about where our defence policy is and our alliance with the United States. And it's like, it's almost it's an interesting psychological, I'm a psychologist obviously, but it looks to me like an interesting psychological phenomenon. It's like the closer the United States comes to handing over, and I'd argue it probably already has its lead position in the world, the more tightly a certain group of people are holding on to the United States as our security blanket, when it's actually the time when we need to be stepping back and looking for alternatives.
We're at this time where AUKUS is imploding, where Trump has, a few balls up in the air, probably not seeing us in the periphery to the point where he didn't even want to meet up with the PM, rushing from one place to the other. It seems so right what you say about there being a really good time right now to review AUKUS, to review the alliance, and to look at a sovereign approach to the region, and redefining it for the first time. How do you feel that, as the discombobulations of Washington are sort of felt across all its allies, uh, Australia is in this musical chairs, seems to be one of the last to want to get off this security blanket. And now there's an unhinged element coming out of Washington. We're seeing it with regards to Iran and a few other things right now. How does this affect Australia's strategic vision and sort of perception?
Yeah, well, I mean, you look at our last defence white paper, which was released in 2024. We're very low risk in as far as we're afraid of change, and because of that, we're not willing to make any big bold moves. And I know that you can argue there's good reason for that, but it's one of those things that by the time it becomes apparent we have to, we've actually left ourselves not much time and not much wriggle room to actually come up with an alternate position. And I guess the United States, I think of the United States as an empire. And so what's an empire? It's basically a wealth pump. So it spreads its tentacle over whatever area it covers, and then it extracts wealth from the periphery and sucks it into the imperial center. So that's how the United States, it wasn't through superior values or whatever. It's just a superior application of violence, enabled the United States to concentrate so much wealth over, I guess when did the American Empire really start? 350 years or there it gets, once it started California and Caribbean and Philippines and stuff like that. So they've had, best part of 2 centuries of that imperial system. And what's happened is that at the start, they're getting great benefit out of the empire, as in low cost, return on investment's very high. You think of California, very limited cost, and huge swathe of land, resources, all the oil and stuff like that they found in California. And so massive return on investment, and then that builds their imperial structure. But as time progresses, that return on investment gets less. And I think you could probably argue that since the end of the Second World War, none of the United States' military adventures that I can think of, so Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and the Afghanistan War being the major sort of conflicts, none of those, I'd argue, would have a positive return on investment. So what actually happens is that the empire is consuming more and more resources, but not gaining anything in return. I think this is where we're at. This is why the United States is in dire trouble, is because they have a commitments crisis. And it doesn't matter what they do at this stage. One of my friends, Warwick Powell, who you might have seen on Twitter, he's quite an astute commentator, and he talks about this autoimmune response. And this is what would happen now on the downside of empire, where everything they try to do to stabilise the empire or maintain it actually has a negative consequence. So it actually has the opposite effect what's intended. So I think the tariffs are a perfect example of that. They've sort of caused more harm to the US economy than they have. I mean, obviously disruptive, but caused more harm to the United States. So this is where we're at. And there's almost a complete, this is everything we see in our media and our political class, our defence and security commentariat, they don't put anything in context. It's like, they sort of put in a little box and don't put in the broader context. And without putting it in that context, it's very hard to actually come up with a sensible approach to how we should deal with it. Because I think when you step back and say, that's the trajectory the United States is on, and there's no, I can't see any way of them working their way out of this predicament they're in, which suggests to me, if that's the direction the United States is going on, I'd prefer to get off the Titanic before it sinks to the bottom of the ocean rather than, cling on hoping that something will pop up, because that's, in the history of empires, that just doesn't really happen. And our cling on approach to the United States is getting more and more, I guess more and more crazy, to put it bluntly.
And it's right, as you say, like after the formation of the Bretton Woods system, the US has been kind of like a cudgel to kind of implement those tentacles and bash more product out of them. And we're seeing these kind of fatal errors, as you mentioned now, where there are tariffs, where any kind of reactive measure seems to be backfiring. I want, this is a response to multipolarism, obviously, to the rise of China. And do you think that America's missed the opportunity to become a more nimble competitor and redefine itself in a multipolar world?
I think I wrote in an article a year or two back, is I think if the United States had have taken because you're looking at long frame history, and we know all empires go through a cycle of, rise and fall. But how quickly that fall or decline occurs, it could happen quickly, as in, say, time frame measured in decades, or it could be measured in centuries. So I really think, and this is the great tragedy of it all, if the United States had have acted rationally, it could have maintained if not dominant, but a very important role in the world for a long time to come, many decades, if not centuries, if it had played its cards right. But I think this is where the non-rational components of our world come into play, and belief in exceptionalism, and that undermines the ability to act rationally. And I think that explains a lot of where we are now. We're not actually talking about things there's sort of that greater belief system. We're talking about, that's I guess what I'm trying to make. We're talking about belief systems now rather than rational assessment of the situation, because we're talking about beliefs, and it gets very difficult to come up with coherent, logical approaches to managing problems when it becomes emotional.
So at that global manifest destiny, we're kind of seeing that in Ukraine right now. That stubborn nature that comes with it, we're seeing it in Ukraine. We're seeing it essentially with the support for Israel and the belligerence around China right now. So on that kind of shift that you're talking about here, like Australia is here with America the whole way through. We're sort of riding the bumps with them right now, looking up at them and dangling a bit of an AUKUS paper in front of them, hoping for the best. You've mentioned that war is essentially about a priority. Avoiding war is a priority in Australia. And given the rise of multipolarism and the regional changes that we're seeing, what do you think are the greatest risks of conflict that could bring Australia in? And how can we temper ourselves to avoid that situation?
Yeah. Malcolm Fraser summed it up in his great little book, Dangerous Allies, when he said that we as in Australia needs the United States for defence, but we only need defence because of the United States. And I think that's a perfect summary. And I don't think it's likely we get involved in another conflict, particularly a major conflict in the Middle East, because I don't think we have the military capability to do any serious war fighting in a conflict with Iran, for example. Maybe I'll be wrong there. We could send some niche forces like special forces or something like that. But I hope not. But I think that the big one is really China. And China is the major competitor of the United States. Its economy, depending how you measure, it's already larger. It obviously has the world's huge manufacturing capacity. It's a major trading partner with the majority of the world's countries, and it's out competing the United States. And this comes back to that exceptionalism. So if another country is outcompeting you and performing better than you and having better outcomes than you, then that's then a threat. And it's quite interesting, just a bit of an aside, in the last 2 days, we've seen both in the ABC AUKUS program last night, the narrator or the journalist said that, China's not a threat to the United States, but it's a threat to its dominance. And then we had Michael Peluso published at the ASPI strategist saying the same thing, that China's not a threat to Australia, but it's the prospect of a wider war that is a threat. So we're not talking about, China's not going to come and attack Australia out of the blue. China's not going to come and attack the United States out of the blue. But China is a threat to our belief system in Western hegemony, the exceptionalism of the United States. And this once again comes back into the sort of, we're not talking about the logic and rationale here. We're talking about the sort of belief systems. And that's what worries me. I have a bit of a feeling that there's some elements in the United States that would rather destroy the world, and probably say the same for Israel, destroy the world rather than living in a world they don't dominate. And that obviously means we're in very, very dangerous position. And of course, because Australia has United States military capabilities on our soil, which the force posture, obviously some of them are long-standing, such as Pine Gap and some of the naval communication assets, but then the force posture agreement, which for agreed facilities allows the US basically unfettered access, and then AUKUS, which was, yes, we talk about the submarines, but it's really about US basing rights, which is the most important part of AUKUS.
Including a bunker at Tyndall that no one knows if there's nuclear tipped weapons in there, right?
Yeah, well, and I got no words when our foreign minister I think it was last year, said we have a policy of not either asking or, whether they're bringing nuclear weapons into this country. It's like, talk about handing over your sovereignty. That's one thing you'd think we would be very interested in knowing or preventing, because that's, we have an obligation to do so, but just turning a blind eye is unfathomable for anyone who has any respect for their sovereignty.
This ideological thing that you mentioned is so common, and I come across it in America and Israel, as you mentioned, but quite often here it's just sort of ingrained into certain parts of people that sort of analyze, produce, and now it's sort of pervaded our public broadcaster, where they're getting Mick Ryan on to talk about his drone company. This weapon, from when Malcolm Turnbull back in, was it 2016 or 2015, when he said he wanted us to be a top 10 arms manufacturer, it sort of started to feel a little bit different from that period onwards, the way we looked at sort of flexing our muscle in that space, looking to acquire contracts and partnerships with foreign arms manufacturers. Does this posture that we're sort of taking, is it outside of our DNA? As a country, do we have the ability to flex this muscle and sustain this kind of posture?
Yeah, I think we like to use the phrase, punch above our weight. I've heard that mentioned many times, talking about our military capabilities, which I think is a load of baloney. I think we're well out on our skis. Without the United States, we're nothing really. We have a fairly, we have a capable military, but it's all relative to other countries and the actual circumstances. So, against a country like, say, Tonga or something like that, yeah, we could crush them. But when we talk about anyone with serious military capability, we're a bit player. And this is yes, we need to be able to defend ourselves, but we could spend every single cent of our GDP on defence, and we still wouldn't be able to have the military capability to have a stand-up fight with China. Obviously we can't do that. We can't even really realistically raise our defence spending much more than what it is without significant issues elsewhere in society and the economy. And so this sort of gung-ho approach, which when you've got, big brother over your shoulder, US empire, who may come to your assistance, it's easy to be a little bit hubristic. But if that's withdrawn, and I mean, you look at the AUKUS, sorry, not AUKUS, the ANZUS treaty, it doesn't actually guarantee any that the United States will come to our aid. So
Definitely not for New Zealand.
yeah, that's right. But all it refers to is consulting, and this is anyone who has any knowledge of history knows that great powers act in their interests. So we can talk about friends and shared values, which I'd hate to think what we actually mean when we say shared values, but friendship, shared values, the alliance, and all the puffery that we hear at AUSMIN and all that sort of stuff. But the United States is not going to do anything to support us if it's not in the United States' interest. So just say, let's hypothetically, that the United States and China came to some arrangement and that meant sacrificing the Australian economy to boost the US. They would do that in a heartbeat. In fact, we have an alliance wouldn't mean anything. And we've already seen that in previous trade disputes where, we have an issue with China who picks up the trade of the United States. So we're fooling ourselves if thinking we have an alliance with the United States actually means anything for our security.
We're seeing that strong arming happening over our rare earth minerals, over embedding intelligence officials at defense, over a whole swathe of things, putting in nuclear waste dumps for submarines we're not going to get. This ideological kind of connection or love for this big brother, it felt with AUKUS was sort of created. There was a lot of opportunism there amongst the coalition. There was a little bit more like dollar signs in their own eyes. But it feels like under Miles and the Labor Party, there is a much more ideological belief in this partnership in the right faction. Actually, Scott Birchall said the other week, if you want to look for the most gung-ho pro-US people, you have to look to the right faction of the ALP. And we're sort of seeing this stubborn nature as they kind of meet Hegseth and it must be some of the most painstaking meetings we've had in our modern history, going across to this sort of this Trump White House and trying to cut or remind them of AUKUS while they're trying to boost our defense spending to a point now where, they used to say that armed neutrality was something that was too expensive. But the way they're pushing this thing up, we're almost at that point now where we could meet that, right? Isn't it like 6% or something like that for neutrality?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the figures, but I mean, this is the irony of it is a mega, our biggest defence procurement project, very expensive, and I like to think of AUKUS. I think we need a new unit of account. So the initial cost of AUKUS was $368 billion. So if we say that's one AUKUS, I'd suggest that we're going to end up paying, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3 AUKUSes, and potentially not get anything out of it. I mean, so I think that's something that we should start talking about because there's no way on earth a project of that complexity, that scale, that much technological risk, which every time you read a new report or article or interview that comes out about AUKUS, the risk is going up. So what does that mean? The cost will go up. And the thing is that it provides a very narrow capability. So very expensive, very narrow capability. And ultimately, they're really designed to sit off the South China Sea and target Chinese, the Chinese mainland or Chinese submarines. They're not actually designed for the defence of Australia. And that was brought out in the ABC Four Corners program last night, where I think is Admiral Briggs, the former commander of the Australian submarine fleet, so they're too big and not agile enough to be used in a lot of the waters around Australia, which straight away says, well, what are we doing? Whereas I'd argue, because once again, it's about the threat. So I struggle to see, and I think Sam Rogovan at Lowy Institute had something out not long ago. What is the actual threat that we're defending against? And to be honest, I think the threat of a land invasion is minuscule. Such a difficult task to achieve. Like, they talk about China struggling to be able to launch an invasion against Taiwan, which, that's all supposition and that, but that's 100 and something kilometres off the Chinese mainland coast. Try doing that over 6,000 kilometres. So actual, the size of the force that could do that is minuscule. And if I was sitting in another country and wanting to harm Australia, I could think of a hell of a lot easier ways. I mean, remember, warfare or conflict, go back to Clausewitz, is all about the continuation of politics by other means. So it's done for a purpose. So if there's to be a military threat to Australia, be done for some political purpose. And I just can't see, that the AUKUS submarines will do anything to support our response to that.
Totally, and a couple of like assorted second-hand and not yet produced Virginia submarines, who might have had a bit more bells and whistles about them in like Hunt for the Red October kind of days. Now in this age of drones and the satellite technology that China deploys in their region now. And now the fact that we can't operate these submarines or really maintain them or yeah, I don't even think we're allowed to use them once we get them, right? So I want to speak to there's so many glaring issues that are just there, and the average punter can sit there at their breakfast and rattle them off one by one now. Not only the operational and the procurement issues, the fact that the Connecticut shipyards have said that they're just never going to be able to make these things, and under the Trump America First review, it's looking further and further away. So what we would need right now would be a functioning media, or some sort of, just to tip this thing, because it's just ready to fall off the cliff, right? And all we need is just some good analysis from maybe the public broadcaster that's not from Mick Ryan, and potentially help to shape the perspectives of these alliances and the threats of going down some of these paths. So what do you reckon is the Australian media's role in maintaining these narratives, these whole riddled narratives that the average punter is scratching their head about?
Yeah, I mean, media, the fourth estate, when I was young, I used to think that the role of media is to hold power to account, but increasingly I think it's more to manage a narrative, particularly on foreign affairs. So that's why the reporting on China, on Ukraine, Russia, Iran, etc. is so woeful, is big, because that's where their most important role is in managing that narrative. But things like AUKUS, when we obviously know all the issues where it's cost of living crisis, or hospitals or roads or infrastructure, or responding to floods, bushfires, whatever. We know there's all these domestic issues, and obviously the government has to respond to pressure put on it by the public. So when there's a big project like this, or a big acquisition, which is very expensive, obviously the most expensive project we've had, and there's a lot of people questioning it, and I mean, it's not just people who of no great public importance, such as myself, but former prime ministers, former commander of the Australian submarine fleet squadron. When these people are starting to make big questions about the viability of the project, well, the media starts to take an interest. So in the long run, I think that the AUKUS was going to implode of its own accord. It's just, it's that crystal glass sort of structure, which is just going to take a hit in the right spot and it's all going to shatter. How long and what that will be, well, who knows? But if we came back in 5 years' time and AUKUS was still going, I would be highly surprised. I think the contradictions and the issues are just getting bigger and bigger. And I mean, well, it was interesting actually during the election. I spoke to lots of people, and including people handing out how to vote cards for the different political parties. And pretty much every Labor person I spoke to, I asked about the submarines, and I don't think I had one positive response. So it's even in the Labor Party, like amongst the rank and file, I don't think there's a lot of support for it. So I think.
How about within the party, Cameron? Do you feel that potentially on the left faction of the Labor Party, they're just waiting for the right way to push this out of Miles's hands?
Yeah, well, who knows? Yeah, there must be, because the government must be under an enormous amount of internal pressure here, and I'm like, you'd like to think that maybe the Prime Minister's just waiting for an opportune moment or something like that, and there'll be an announcement, or there's just some report or event or something that happens that's so it gives them that opportunity. But I mean, with
had
the
enough
election,
already.
Exactly. Well, you think how many of these chances you need, and particularly like, if I had the opportunity to make the decision and say, well, there's no way you can look at this and say it's a good deal. I've just won an election overwhelmingly. And I know that if, that obviously the House of Reps was not going to be an issue. And I know that like the Greens or the crossbench will support us in the Senate. We could either have an inquiry or, given how AUKUS was brought about, we could just can it. And the political capital that would be lost from that early on in the election time frame, by the time it gets to the next election, no one's going to give it, no one's going to be caring about that, because I think we can see what's happening in the world and the pace of events. In 2.5, if we canned AUKUS now or had already canned it, in 2.5 years, people are going, AUKUS, what's that? Like, it would be irrelevant when it comes to the electoral cycle. So I don't know, but maybe it just is that that right wing, the ALP, and their ideological position, and maybe it's 5-dimension chess being played by the Prime Minister, who's going to let Miles just keep going further and further out on his skis until he looks, he becomes replaceable. But I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know enough about the internal politics.
It definitely feels a bit like Miles's baby at the moment, I mean, there's not too many others putting their hand up with him apart from Pat Conroy. And that's sort of what I wanted to speak about a little bit too. Like we keep giving away increments of what you call it, like a unit of AUKUS. That's the most scary unit of measurement I've ever heard of in my life. $500 billion a pop. But so we're giving away $5 point somethings of AUKUS's, $5 billion a day, a month. So at the moment, I think we gave away another little batch of billions to maintain their subfleet, or
I think it's 600 or 800 million or something like that. I think there's like 6 or 8 payments like that scheduled over the next few years to build the US submarine. I mean, this is ridiculousness. China, we could just go and order them from China. We'll get them far more quicker. And when they're patrolling off the coast, off the South China Sea, we could send them in for a quick maintenance run before they come home.
And on that, right? So we've got the Soyuz class submarines that came and went with Japan. We had those cutting edge conventional submarines with France. The Germans have a pretty good option. The Swedes have a pretty good option. So what would be a alternative if AUKUS disappeared tomorrow?
I think we need they talk about, every time the government does something, cynical as first principles and nothing's left. We'll have it wide open to ideas, but that's what we really need. Is we need to fundamentally rethink our security on the basis that we won't have the United States. But I guess tied into that, it shouldn't be a defence strategy, because if you're in defence, you see everything as a threat. And this is why we've ended up with this. Our primary defence objective is deterrence. And I would argue that deterrence is going to fail, and it's actually it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because we need to arm up, and then that means we're so focused on China, we don't thinking about what the implications are in our region. Like Indonesia's going to be the I think 4th or 5th largest economy in the world, and they've joined BRICS. They're they can manage their relationships with China. So what we really need to really think about our place in the world before we start designing our the capabilities that we need. But we don't do that. We just we've set ourselves on a trajectory. We're unwilling to change, even though you can see just with what's happening in the United States, we have to change. But I think we're going to run to failure. I think that's ultimately what's going to happen. We're going to run our defence policy to failure. Hopefully that just means some awkward moments and embarrassment, as we said, we didn't see this coming for the last 15, 20 years, and now the US is no longer able to support us, as opposed to gets involved in a conflict, most likely with China, that ends up changing the entire trajectory of this country.
And this is all happening amongst a very dynamic Asia Pacific region, where there's a new deal going on between the nations of Asia. China's forging sort of relationships with countries it's shared like centuries of animosity with, sharing high-speed rail networks, sharing technology for I saw the nickel industry in Indonesia has been transformed on a massive multi-billion-dollar Chinese project, and it's sent our nickel industry into the Stone Age. Australia seems to keep missing out. I remember the recent ASEAN meeting in Australia, where it just felt like Penny Wong was sort of waving her finger at them and telling them off about not doing enough about China. And not Mahathir, Anwar Ibrahim made a very good speech in reply. It feels like there's a whole new balance sort of happening there in this new multipolar world with BRICS, and Asia seems to be the best place in the world to be right now. So how can Australia sort of step out of this ideological haze and start capitalizing sooner rather than later, maybe having our cake and eating it too for a little while, but how do we start transitioning our eggs into this basket?
Well, I don't think it's too late right up to the point we get involved in a war with China. So as long as we avoid that outcome, I think, we have chances. So if the United States sort of gets over itself and says, all right, we've tried everything we can, going to war with China is going to be counterproductive and we just need to work out, all well and good. So as long as we avoid that outcome, I don't think it's too late. But I mean, we come at this, we're looking at the end of 400 or 500 years of Western hegemony dominance, and we're coming now to a era which is really a reversion to the historical mean, where Asia is the dominant sort of region in the world. And that's just is what it is. Like, there's no point getting emotional about it, because that's just, you look at the size of Asia, you look at the resources got, the people, and that, well, it's no surprise that that's where we're heading. So we need to get over ourselves a little bit, and I think we have way too much hubris. We talk about our values as if like other cultures don't have values, and like Europeans have been in Australia 200 since 1788. So we're newcomers, whereas these ancient civilizations, India, China, the whole sort of area of Asia, up into Iran, Persia, all these civilizations have been around for thousands of years, and we don't have to like them, or there's some things we mightn't like and they don't align with our culture and values, but we certainly need to respect them. So I think the first major step we need to do is, and this is long term, is we need to actually start learning about our region, engaging with our region, and I'm talking like in schools, like our language. What we're teaching kids language-wise is going downhill. Like, I think for Indonesia, etc., it's gone, downhill for 20, 30 years. So it's going to be the third or fourth biggest economy in the world. And if we don't have people learning that language, how do we expect to be able to engage, understand, with a powerhouse on our border, if we don't even have a decent size of population who can speak their language? So I guess if I was king for the day, the first thing I'd do is every Australian student, you're going away for 6 weeks or 2 months to an overseas country, preferably that doesn't speak English, and you're going to open your eyes to the world, immerse yourself, and come back with a little bit of context about, there's a world outside Australia, and we can benefit greatly from that understanding, because with everything else, without that base understanding and improvement of awareness and different cultures and their histories and their complexities, everything else will be very, very difficult if we don't achieve that. That'd be the first step.
That's a good start. And it feels like it's harkening back to the mid-90s on steroids a little bit. Those Indonesian classes I didn't pay too much attention to in high school were all the rage, and for quite a while Mandarin classes were too. There seemed to be no problem thinking and dreaming in an Asian language up until maybe Tony Abbott hosted joint military operations with the Chinese in 2013 or something like that. So that muscle memory of that kind of will to be connected to Asia is within us. Do you feel like, just say potentially how, it's a bit of an aside here, but how the German industrial base has essentially been crippled or sabotaged by their relationship with the US? Do you feel that Australia's potential with trade, its economy, its ability to dream big in the region is also being inhibited by our greatest friend in Washington?
Yeah, well, once again, it comes back to, whose interests we have a great power, the United States, even as it declines, obviously much more powerful than Australia. And I guess one of the last articles I wrote in Pearls and Irritations was talking about how on the upside of empire, being a vassal state or a sub-imperial power, which is Clinton Fernandez wrote in his little book, Australia Is, had benefits. But on the downside, those benefits, those advantages actually turn into real threats to our our sovereignty, our independent decision making, and I mean, the project of disentangling ourselves from the United States is an enormous one, and we haven't even really. Well, I guess maybe in the last few, with I mean, Trump's just a symptom, not the cause. But maybe in the last few months, with people, we're starting to see conversations and some recognition that being all in with the United States is not a good idea. But I do think that we're going to be used for the United States' benefit to our detriment. So we're going to take a hit one way or another. We're going to take a hit as the empire ends, or we try to make some, we can try and do it slowly. Like, I'd love if I was writing the checks, Pine Gap closed, forced posture agreement torn up, no US military forces in Australia. I'd love to do that, but I don't think that's practical because of the response. So even if we try to do it, sort of slowly and without actually stating our intent, we're still going to take a hit. And our politicians love kicking the can down the road. And the longer we kick it, the bigger the kick in the backside we're going to get when it actually, when it comes to the crunch. And I think there will be a crunch in the not too distant future.
Yeah, all right. We might have to hit rock bottom, as humans always seem to do. So where do you see the media sitting in this as far as its ability to save itself or offer itself as a viable option to a consumer?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I've come to the view that our media, it's there to manage a narrative, particularly with regards to foreign affairs, and I can't see how it's going to be reformed internally, which is why, that's why I'm so happy to be here speaking to you tonight, Joel, because there's so many platforms now and other voices available where people can get more information, other perspectives in the world. And I think this is what's going to, it's going, you think in evolutionary terms, it's going to maybe not replace, but it's certainly going to put a lot of pressure on the media over the long term to actually fix up its game. So, the more conversations we have like this with people looking at new ideas, new approaches, cutting through the messaging that they want us to internalize, I think the better in the long run for all of us.
Yeah, that's right, Cameron. And this wasn't my, first port of call. I've got a day job, I've got a kid, and I'd love for some of these, resourced, technical subject matter expertise to get off their ass and actually start interviewing people like you, talking to people like Scott Birchall, allowing these voices of, these rational voices to transcend that subjectivity, right?
Yeah, well, the media watch thing on Monday was brilliant. So I've been Major General Mick Ryan, retired. I had a little bit to do with him in the Army, not much, but he's the go-to man for all these. He's our leading strategist apparently. He's been the go-to man for the war in Ukraine and other things for years. And what do we find out on Monday via Media Watch? The military technology he pushes the most, well, he actually has a financial interest in a company that produces them. And the media, they just keep recycling the same people, yet there's a whole range of other voices there who they don't even look to. And this is I think the largest part of how the propaganda works in our media is they just pick who gets on and who doesn't. So you don't see a Colonel Douglas McGregor or a Glenn Deason or a Professor Jeffrey Sachs. You don't see them getting onto the ABC. They just keep recycling Mick Ryan because he's peddling the line they want to be peddled. But this is why social media is such a powerful and important thing.
And even your average consumer now starting to go, why is this Mick Ryan on there talking about bloody his drones all the time? And like adding to that, like even Green, he had that business class trip to a German weapons ThyssenKrupp or something like that, $16,000 junket. This guy's from the ABC, and he's going off pretending he's working and then saying, "Oh, I wasn't working." It's a real shame seeing the very small cohort of defense and regional affairs kind of correspondence sort of falling into this sort of vortex as well. So let's hope, yeah, a couple of bogans on the outside might get him eventually. But it'd be great to think that there might be something else that trickles down eventually. But it doesn't seem that way. Like the Albanese government's parlayed with the commercial press again. I think it feels like it can weather this storm after its second election victory. But, it went into 2022 equipped with a public mandate, two former prime ministers, and a Murdoch Royal Commission ready to go. It would have been a different landscape right now talking about all these matters we've discussed tonight if potentially something like that had gone through, right?
Yeah, that's, I think we've legalized corruption basically in our political system. And we're reaping the results of that. And I guess the silver lining is a system like that is not sustainable in the long term. It's just that, and I think it'll right itself in the long run, but it could be awfully untidy in the intervening years, particularly if they start cracking down on, alternate voices or, as they tried with the misinformation and disinformation bill, which of course was only aimed at social media, not at, mainstream media, which I would argue is both the biggest source of disinformation and misinformation, as well as the most influential. So, but that was something that had a massive public reaction. That's where it comes to us, and that's one of the reasons why I sort of talk right, happy to participate in things like that, is because the more people who get up, bolshy, arguing, putting alternate cases forward, the harder it is for the political system to clamp down. So it's not just a few crazies in the wilderness making these claims, when it's a large percentage of the population demanding that we have better. Well, hopefully that we call ourselves a democracy, that pressure will result in positive outcomes in the long term.
Pray and hope for that. Look, there's something, the double-edged sword of tall poppy syndrome. I'm hoping potentially that thing pops up soon and just starts knocking these. Australians don't like being bullshitted, and I think we've been asleep for a long time, getting bullshitted for a long time, and a few of us are starting to wake up that we've got a whole backlog of bullshitting we haven't realised that's been going on for quite a while. Looking forward, how does Australia's role in this multipolar world even look like in the short to medium term? And how do we balance our values and interests and, our imperative to avoid war?
Yeah, well, I'd like us to actually, the values we talk about, I'd like us just to follow them rather than pretending we have these values. But look where we are in the world. You look at a map of Australia and you look north, and where are we? We're in, the most dynamic part of the world. Kishore Mahbubani, the Singaporean diplomat, wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Asian 21st Century. I'd actually argue it's a Euro-Asian 21st century. But historically, that's been the powerhouse of the global economy, except for the last several hundred years. And that's what it's returning to. So we can either be part of that, benefit from it, make the most of it, or we can try to fight against it and, try and rely on, the United States across the other side of the Pacific, or the UK, and Europe, halfway around the world, which just does not make any logical sense. Now, obviously, this has some challenges because we have, a predominantly Anglo-Saxon sort of background, even though we are a multicultural country, but we can't change our geography. So we either, as Keating said, we either get our security in Asia, or we need our security in Asia, not from Asia, because if we're dependent on security outside of Asia, sooner or later, that's going to fail. So if we just take that on board and think, well, hang on, we need another approach. And I'm quite positive. I think we have a lot of challenges, regardless of all the geopolitical stuff. We have a lot of challenges with our economy and that. But the best way to actually deal with these, I think, is through engaging in our region, helping to build up Pacific Island family. I think so much of what we do there is framed around security as opposed to their development. And so if we acted out of a more altruistic approach in thinking in the long term, their economic development is much more important, and from that will derive security. Yeah, I mean, we have a big opportunity, as you can see, with BRICS is getting bigger and bigger. We've just said Indonesia, which is going to be the 4th largest economy in the world, is already one of the largest, has just joined BRICS. How much discussion has there been on that in Australia? Virtually none. It's like we're burying our heads in the sand. And not only Indonesia, but Thailand and Malaysia are partner members of BRICS. I believe in the last couple of days, Vietnam has either become or will become a member of BRICS. So there's this new organizer, well, not that new now, it's like 15 years old or thereabouts. And what impresses me about it is it's just very business-like, whereas so much of what we're doing is theatrics and when we look at our announcements and that, it's all about the big announcement, but doesn't seem to be much follow through, whereas BRICS just seems to be getting stuff done slowly over time, because they're very complex issues and some of these countries have difficult issues, and India seems to be going its own path a bit at the moment, but I think they can see that they've got the long-term objective in mind, and they're working towards that, and they can see that through mutual activities or projects of mutual benefit, they all benefit, and then they can use that space to then resolve the various issues that countries might have. Whereas I think as we get more stressed, as the United States and the Western hegemony sort of crumbles around us, our thought processes and our horizons are looking shorter and shorter. And as a result, that's why I think we're reverting to this fear-based approach to the world.
And BRICS, though, it seems like China's economic success and things like BRICS are also factored into its threat matrix as well. So, there could be a potential that even considering joining BRICS would be seen as a betrayal from Washington, right?
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's, yes, it could, but I mean, and this is where we have to play our cards sensibly, but you got to think things don't happen linearly. It's not like, or something. Some things do, but quite often in these sort of geopolitical events and that, we can have these non-linear events. So very quickly, sort of things can change. If for example, the United States sort of tries to help, this is just a hypothetical, but tries to help out Israel, and Iran holds them off, and it just becomes very clear that US power is gone. You could see that there could be that opportunity for a big shift, away from the United States towards other organizations or relations with other countries. So I think these things can happen relatively quickly. But this is why we need to be discussing them now, because what are the opportunities? How can we go about it? And maybe we don't do anything about it, but when the moment comes, we're at least prepared that we can actually make some of these decisions. And I'd like to think, within government, within DFAT, and that maybe some of these discussions are happening. But really, not a lot of hope when there's no public discussion on it. If we can't mention BRICS and Indonesia joining it and what that means to Australia, that doesn't hold much hope that these serious sort of discussions are happening within government.
It's quite incredible to see how we've just been glancing over Indonesia into another hemisphere for so long now. Just as they're making these massive steps, and their economy is transforming in ways that, we're going to be looking up at them potentially as a threat in 10 years' time, based on that same ignorance that defines our foreign policy at the moment. When you saw Albo go, pick up the phone after his election, and he's the first person he wants to speak to is his Indonesian neighbor, and he was riding the bike after he won the election in 2022. It's many Australians' dream that we start laying down these tracks, but the yellow peril followed by, the all-white Channel 7 studios and the all-white Channel 10 studios and the all-white ABC studios. And, there hasn't been an Asian on Home and Away in a long time. And there's this kind of like disconnect and fear of engaging. What could give us the confidence of feeling that we're an Asian nation? You've mentioned the school programs, you've mentioned, sending people out for experience. But, is there a way of being able to kind of close this gap a little bit?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When I went to high school at Country Victoria, I think there's a couple of Aboriginal kids, and I can remember one or two kids of Italian sort of heritage, maybe Greek, but pretty much everyone, hundreds of kids was, white Anglo-Saxon. Whereas my kids, you drive past any school in Brisbane, and I'm sure it's the same, and probably more so in Melbourne, and there's people from all over the world in our schools. So I think this current generation actually has a much greater, naturally, they make friends with people from all over the world just because they're exposed to different cultures. And like one of the local primary schools kids went to, they have a multicultural night where, people, because they had, I think, something ridiculous, like 150 nations that kids from the school came from. So people come from all over the world. They cook, originate from all over the world. They come and cook up their sort of national dishes at a school night and that. So, I mean, I think it's happening through that community level already to an extent. But as you sort of said, it's at the top echelons, or in the media. And I think in our defence and security, we haven't got that level of diversity. So increasing the diversity and like exchanges, like whether I had the benefit last year of a trip to China, which was funded by the Australia-China, that's an Australian government foundation for Australia-China relations. I can't remember the exact name, but I got the opportunity to go for a week up to the Yellow River, a couple of Chinese cities.
Wow.
It's just an eye-opening experience. And lots of people who I've spoken to have been to China, sort of similar sort of view. And I was talking to someone just the other day, and I told them about it, and like you just see they were scared of China, and it's like, well, weren't you scared? And I said, no, I actually felt safer walking around Chinese cities, which I've never been to before and don't speak a word of Chinese, so other than hello, than I do in some parts of Australia. So I guess it's the key to it's just exposure and engagement.
And potentially a change in philosophy. The Confucian nations of Eastern Asia seem to be having a bit of a different approach to metrics of success, whereas the West is still looking at meting out punishment and death from above to maintain its empire. And Australia is a part of that, still of that sort of thought pattern and that sort of philosophy, right? Is a part of it also engaging this sort of Asian way of thinking to change our philosophy of what our success means?
Yeah, well, how often do you read something and it's got, democracy versus authoritarians? You read it everywhere. And as soon as I start reading that, I think, well, this sort of analysis, or it's not really analysis, it's an ideological piece. And I know China's got big problems, but they've lifted 600 or 800 million people out of poverty over the last 20, 30, 40 years. Like that is just unheard of in human history. That's a unique experience in human history. So what can we learn from that? I don't think we've learned anything. And we can see that our systems are increasingly less effective. So rather than getting, just stamping a foot saying democracy better. I mean, I don't think it's a accurate term to describe a country like China as being authoritarian. But we need to break through and actually start, learning about other cultures rather than just getting on our high horse and presuming we have the best system. I mean, what's the best system is relevant relative to the culture of the people, their lived experience, and events that happened in their past. And if we had a much greater understanding of why China is the way it is, we might have a greater respect. And like one example, I think in the US and Australia, we've got about 8 hectares of arable land per person. China has half a hectare of arable land per person. So straight away, that has massive ramifications on how a society is organised. Like when you have 8 hectares, you can not look after the land so well, and you've still got plenty of land to feed people. Whereas when you have half a hectare, your margin of error is basically nothing. So if you get it wrong, you're going to starve, you're going to have famine, you're going to have internal unrest. So trying to understand the context rather than judging and saying our system's better, I think we just need to learn to understand people's and countries' context, and from that we can learn a bit of humility, and then work out how to engage and take what's good from their system, or learn what's good and how it can be adapted into our context, or maybe there isn't that much that we could adopt, but at least because we understand it, when we're dealing with them, we can have a far more sensible approach, as opposed to this sort of fairly hubristic, belligerent approach that we seem to take.
And we can potentially build a rational and pragmatic security framework around that consciousness too, right?
And I mean, that's the core of it. When you understand people and you know where you come from, when you have empathy, like strategic empathy. I mean, the war in Ukraine would not have happened.
Strategic empathy, I love it.
Yeah, no, it's not my term, but yeah, if we had some strategic empathy, the war in Ukraine wouldn't have occurred. And it's the same thing in China. Like if we want a war over Taiwan, it's very simple. We get the Taiwanese to declare independence. That will be a trigger for war. We know that, so let's have the strategic empathy to understand that there's no point putting US military forces on Taiwan Island and some of its offshoots, which are literally within viewing distance of the mainland China. I mean, that's just you're stoking problems. But unfortunately, that's our philosophy, is that particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom, unfortunately, they like that divide and conquer, stoking troubles. They're doing it for centuries, and I can't see how we change that. But Australia doesn't need to play that game. Unfortunately, we come from that sort of cultural background, but we don't need to follow that game.
Well, that's someone on Twitter, a rando on Twitter wrote somewhere the other week that, and Australia is essentially still a colonial kind of dominion that hasn't quite found its independence yet. Hasn't quite found hasn't had its war of independence yet, right?
Yeah, well, yes, agree. And you look at something like the Persia or India or China, and they've been around for thousands. One thing I learned when I was in China, like their first agricultural scientists dates back 2,000 years. So that gives you a bit of an indication of the age of these civilizations and how they've evolved over time. Whereas I see us as Australia, I still see us like as a young buck, as a juvenile, still trying to find our place in the world. And hopefully in 2,000 years we'll be a bit more sensible in our approach to the region we are now. But it'd be nice to think we could do that, maybe in the next generation or two, because there's so much to gain from it and so much to lose if we get it wrong.
Yeah, hopefully we can be a bit more eclectic, hey, in the future.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming and joining the program, Cameron. It's been fantastic having you here, and yeah, hopefully in the future we could get you on, as all these developments are sort of shuffling around from day to week to month. It'd be great to get you back on in the future to have a chat again.
Love to, Joel. It'd be great.
Thanks a lot, mate. Cheers.